I'm Steve Stoliar, and this is the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, this is awesome. First off, I love doing these things remotely. You know, now that COVID is a little more manageable and we're a little more used to it. We're
between variants.
That's true. Yeah. We are prepared for the Omega and Omega.
They're going to be to Zeta before you know it, and then back to Alpha.
Yes. Okay, so you've written a couple of books. One of them is about Groucho Marx and your time spent working with him. You were one of the last people that worked with him. You got to see sort of the very end. And your book is called Raised Eyebrows, and hopefully someday it'll be made into a movie. But it covers the life.
Oh, it's more than hopefully someday.
Oh, are we getting close?
Oh, it's more than hopefully someday.
Nice. So we're gonna.
What time is it now? 11 o'clock.
It's 11
o'clock. It's supposed to shoot in September.
Is that right?
Yes. This has been. Well, see, now we're wagging the dog here. It had been a dream of mine to have the book turned into a motion picture, and it has been a long and winding road. A phrase that Lennon and McCartney stole from me some years back. But we are finally on track to shoot this thing probably in September. And there's a wonderful director named Oren Moverman who you might, with your military background, be familiar with a film he did with Woody Harrelson called The Messenger, where he drives around to people to let them know their loved ones were killed in Iraq. He was up for an Oscar for writing that, and he and I co-wrote the screenplay. Jeffrey Rush is going to play the older Groucho.
Oh, I love it.
And he's champing at the bit and immersing himself in footage and interviews and everything he can find to throw himself into this. Erin Fleming, who was the young, ambitious actress who insinuated herself in his life towards the end, is being played by Sienna Miller, who is no slouch by any.
No, she is not
by any definition. And then, of course, the most surreal aspect of it is that young Steve Stoliar, i.e. me, I'm going to be played by a young actor named Charlie Plummer, who he was in All the Money in the World. He played the kidnapped Getty, and he was just in Moonfall. And Oren has worked with him before on a movie called The Dinner with Richard Gere. And it wasn't necessary that he looked just like I looked at 20, because only, my sisters and my cousins would care that there's a... So what I tell people is either we look enough alike to be neighbors, or if you put a picture of me at 20 next to a picture of him now, we are eerily dissimilar. Either way. And I remember I was on the set of Cafe Society, the Woody Allen film. I've known Woody for a number of years, and he wrote me and said, feel free to come by the set and watch how not to make a movie. So we were talking about potential casting for my movie, and he got to me and he said, and nobody knows what you look like. You could get Orlando Bloom to play you.
Yeah.
So it isn't Orlando Bloom, but anyway.
What is the actor's name? Tell us again.
Charlie Plummer. Plummer. No relation to Christopher, even though they were both in All the Money in the World, Stranger Than Fiction. I'm not making it up. Anyway, it is going to blow what's left of my mind to walk onto a set that recreates a house that I spent the better part of 3 years in the 1970s, seeing people play people that I knew, including myself at 20, and saying things based on things I actually said. I mean, it's whatever meta has come to mean.
Yeah.
This is that exponentially. So I'm pretty jazzed about that. But for those who aren't familiar with the book, they've switched to something else by now, long ago, I'm sure.
Well, let me ask a question because a similar kind of thing is going on in my life. My buddy Johnny Walker is probably the most notable Iraqi interpreter. He was my interpreter for a minute. He also was like the SEALs interpreter for the entire conflict.
Wow.
And he has been on more SEAL missions than any SEAL. That's how long he did this for. And so he wrote this best-selling book about his life, and it's a crazy story. And because he was my interpreter for a minute, I'm in the book. And so one of the things I'm dying to do, and I want to do this with you now too, now that I found it out, is once we get into production and everything's cast, and Johnny's like, "You're going to play yourself," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not an actor, but whatever." I want to interview the actor. I want to interview me, once the actor is there. So I want to have you sit with me here or wherever, and you and I interview Mr. Plummer together, because that would be a hoot.
It would. And I mean, I can't speak for what the schedule is or the people's schedule, so I can't say, oh, yes, I'm sure I can. Let me know what your schedule
and I'm not
is.
Putting you on the
let
spot
me call
either.
Charlie, whom I've never met.
Yeah.
And tell him we're doing that. But as my father used to say, we'll see.
Yeah.
Which usually, when he said it, usually meant no, and he didn't want to say it, but we'll see. So
when I was talking at dinner last night, there were some young people at the table. They are 21 years old, basically. And I said, have you guys ever heard of or thought of or seen or recognized the name Groucho Marx? And they both said no. So, and granted, the person's, Groucho's been dead for almost 50 years, and he hasn't been relevant in society to a young person in probably, longer than like a kid. I remember as a kid when they re-aired the game show.
You Bet Your Life.
Yeah, I remember that as like a 5-year-old kid, that being on. And because how do you, as a little kid, a little boy, how do you not love Groucho and what I don't even understand half the jokes, but there's, a duck falling from the,
Right.
So even for me, I barely remember that. And I know that, all these movies are there, but they weren't part of my zeitgeist, right?
Well, and I didn't grow up during the Depression,
Right.
Bringing bottles back to get the deposit so I could pay 15 cents to see duck soup in the bitter cold, but my peers, we all were into old movies. And of course, this was before the convenience of TCM and even videotape, never mind streaming or DVDs or Blu-rays. And yet we would stay up late and watch shows on local TV, putting up with Cal Worthington's car commercials and all
his
sorts.
Dog Spot.
Yes. And just will ourselves to stay awake till 2:18 because Horse Feathers was going to be on, or Lives of a Bengal Lancer with Gary Cooper, or whatever it is. So we knew about all of these people, all the people that pop up in Warner Brothers cartoons and caricature, Hugh Herbert and Greta Garbo and James Stewart and Gable, and all these people. We knew who they were, even though it wasn't the 30s. And it's strange because now you would think, because all you have to do, I mean, anyone with an iPhone can pull something out of their pocket and punch, and watch a feature-length movie if I mention it, or Google a person's name and see dozens of photos and go, oh, yeah, that guy. But I think because there is so much, what do they call it, content now, it's too much to expect that a young person is going to gravitate towards an old black and white movie when there's so much, full color, rapidly edited stuff, and they'll get all the references. I got an email from my niece last night saying that her son, who is just in his teens, doesn't know who Dustin Hoffman is. And I said, why would he?
Yeah.
What has he done recently enough that it would have registered? And her son is brilliant and aware of all sorts of things, but it just didn't register. And I've gotten past the clucking my tongue and shaking, these kids today, they don't know who Clark Gable was. They don't know who, and it's a bridge that burns behind us. So it's like, every 10 years, the people we think they'll never forget becomes even more it vanishes behind you. So you get, for instance, even Dustin Hoffman, not known to the youngest generation. Forget about Fred Astaire.
Mm-hmm.
Forget about the Marx Brothers. The Three Stooges are better known generally, partly because they're so much more visible. I mean, they made dozens and dozens of short films from the 30s to the late 50s, and then a few features in the 60s. So their stuff is always being shown and reshown, and there's been more merchandising with the Three Stooges. The Marx Brothers only made about a dozen movies, and then that was it. So there's a smaller pool of material to be exposed to. But I've gotten, as I say, I actually now, if it's someone under, say, 50, I will start out assuming they don't know who I'm talking about.
Right.
I don't know what I'm talking about. They don't know who I'm talking about. So it works well. And then if I say, oh, you know who he is, they'll often say, of course, who doesn't know who Groucho Marx is? Oh, my God.
But that's where it stops, right?
I was yeah. But Dick Cavett, just to drop a name, which I will do. Dick Cavett sent me a COVID mask that had the Hirschfeld caricature of Groucho across the mouth.
Mm.
So I was at Ralph's supermarket purchasing groceries, of all things. And a middle-aged woman, she said, "Oh, I love your mask." And I said, "Thank you. Do you recognize it?" And she said, "I know it. It looks familiar." And I said, it was an old comedian. And she went, "Oh, right." And then she held up her hand and did a perfect imitation of Charlie Chaplin's dinner roll dance from the Gold Rush.
Right.
So does she get part credit for knowing that an old comedian with a mustache?
Yeah.
So I've gotten past saying, you ought to know these things. I mean, where's your, pop culture? It didn't all start with Titanic, the movie. There was also Titanic, the ship in 1912. And,
yeah.
And I used to think they don't know anything before Star Wars. Well, now you have fathers saying, I saw Star Wars when I was a kid. My dad took, and, I lose track of time. And anyway, but the Marx Brothers were a firm part of my growing up, and all of my peers were Groucho fans, when Marx Brothers fans, and we would learn the dialogue and swap the lines and we could only learn them from watching the shows and then from getting that LP that came out in the early 70s of excerpts from their films.
Yeah.
And I never dreamed I would meet Groucho. I used to actually literally dream of meeting Groucho, and they would be so vivid, and I would think, oh my God, it's really him, it's really him. And then it would dissipate as I would wake up, and I would think, damn it, it was right there. And so when I did finally meet him, it was a literal and figurative dream come true.
I want to ask,
yes, sir.
I want to ask you about, because you worked with Groucho at the conclusion of his life, and you dreamt about it. But is there another person from your youth who you're like, if not Groucho, it would have been like, this was the pinnacle person? Like if you asked me at the right era of my life, it would have been Gilligan from Gilligan's Island, or something like that, right? But it was Groucho for you. Could there have been a better person for you to have done this with?
He was at the top of my short list.
Okay.
It really was the Marx Brothers, and then of the Marx Brothers, Groucho. I just related to his wordplay, his audacity, saying the things that we wish we could say, but we don't want to get in trouble. And that seamless blend of clever dialogue and physical comedy, sometimes, slapstick, but not the kind of stuff the Three Stooges were doing. So it's this wonderful blend of verbal and visual. And then Groucho was just the one I gravitated. Didn't mean I didn't love W.C. Fields or appreciate Laurel and Hardy or, any number of a lot of romantic comedies of the 30s. I'm crazy about those. But yeah, it was Groucho. Number two probably would have been Fred Astaire, and I did get to spend a bit of time with him,
Oh wow.
which was very gratifying, but not working with him. And
Groucho's one of those people who he was 20 something years old when Flight begins. You know, he lives through World War One. He lives through the Depression. He lives through Moonshot, all of that stuff.
it was mind blowing. Well, that was, I mean, and in the book, Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, available in paperback and Kindle and audiobook with me, big surprise, doing all of the voices. Um, now I've derailed my own train of thought. What was I talking about?
The moonshot and everything.
The moonshot.
Life,
in my book,
yeah.
Raised Eyebrows. Wait, we've done this.
Yeah.
I will take it out when we're edited. This isn't going to air for weeks, right?
Yes.
I mentioned that I came to appreciate Groucho on three distinct levels. First of all, there he was, Groucho Marx, that man with the grease paint mustache that flirted with Thelma Todd and swirled around Margaret Dumont and hosted You Bet Your Life. In the flesh, there he was at the lunch table talking to me about vaudeville or politics or whatever. And then second, he was someone who knew personally mythic figures to me in three dimensions, like George Gershwin. He was friends with George Gershwin and Irving Berlin and W.C. Fields. He knew Fields. It wasn't just a black and white flickering figure. And then that third level, which, as you mentioned, was that this was a man who was born in 1890, literally a Victorian, except he was American. But Queen Victoria, when Groucho was born, Victoria had another 11 years on the throne. And his firsthand memories extend from before the Wright brothers to after Neil Armstrong's giant leap for mankind. I asked him once, how far back do you remember? And he said, I guess the Spanish-American War, which was 98.
Yeah.
And some may not realize that when the Marx Brothers started out, they were singers and only later gradually incorporated comedy in their material and their shows. But Groucho was a teenager when he was asked to be part of a special performance at the Metropolitan Opera House on the same bill with Enrico Caruso to raise money for victims of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake.
Wow.
Something we're used to seeing in flickering newsreel footage or photographs, horse-drawn carts and all that. This was Groucho's youth. So, you know, I've always been a fanatical history buff. I mean, I was Groucho's archivist, so assembling all of his memorabilia was just a dream job. So I was able to also pull back and just appreciate him as this living link to this astonishing swath of history from the 1890s up through, at the time now, which was the mid 70s. And, you just get all these little tidbits of information about what life was like back then with horse-drawn carriages and the ragtag life of being in vaudeville and traveling by train and all this stuff. And Groucho talked about how, the show they had was their first Broadway success was I'll Say She Is. And they ended up playing the night that President Harding died unexpectedly, natural causes, which was 1923.
Also San Francisco. That's where he died.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
The San Francisco earthquake.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, this is 23. So Groucho said they were playing a theater that had an aluminum roof. And he said that night, because people were so upset about the president dying, there was nothing got a laugh, and all you could hear was the sound of the raindrops pinging against the aluminum roof. This vivid moment from what is now 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And Harding wasn't even a good president.
Yeah.
Imagine,
Also, I think it was his, or maybe it might have been Calvin Coolidge's son, died from a blister because Groucho was older than antibiotics. I mean, it's
well,
totally different
the
times.
mortality rate, people will ask me how many Marx Brothers were there, and even that is not an easy. You'd think, I know I have two older sisters.
Yeah,
There have always been 3 Stoliar children. Well, there were either 3, 4, 5, or 6 Marx Brothers, depending on how deeply you delve into their story. In the films, initially, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zeppo. On the stage, initially, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Gummo, the straight man, who left to fight World War I. And so 17-year-old Zeppo was drafted, not into the army, but into the act so they could keep the 4 Marx Brothers. And Zeppo was never happy in front of the camera. He liked the lifestyle, the money and the dames and that sort of thing. But he was never comfortable as a performer. Yeah. So after Duck Soup in 1933, he left the act and became an agent and never looked back. He was he was very successful at that and represented Gable and Lombard and Barbara Stanwyck and Lana Turner. It was a big agency. But the 6th brother was Manfred, which we didn't know about. When I went to work for Groucho, I didn't know that there had been another brother.
Right.
But when Hector Arce, who was Groucho's biographer, got a photostat of Groucho's birth certificate, it indicated that there had been 3 children previous to Groucho's birth, and Hector and I thought, wait, Chico and Harpo.
Yeah.
So we went into Groucho's bedroom and said, did your parents have another child? And Groucho said, yes, Manfred. He died when he was a baby. And I asked what he died of, and Groucho said, old age. But that's the sort of thing. I mean, the mortality rate back in the 1880s was colossal. And that was before antibiotics. It was before all the vaccinations that we take for granted.
It's also, I want to jump in, and then I want to start talking about the other book.
Sure.
But, I discovered my birth half of my father's side, right? Like my birth father and his whole family and that whole history. And then you look, and they were LA people pretty early on. And there was a family, my grandfather's family, they lost 3 boys before really truly adulthood. And it completely waylays the entire family's life and journey, because you lose a kid to appendicitis, you lose a kid to appendicitis, you lose another kid. And then you're just like, what are we going to do? And parents are struggling. Today, marriages don't often survive the death of a child. And
right.
you had 3 of them, and so these struggles, we can get.
How do you even, well, obviously contraception wasn't then what it is now, but how do you even sign up to try it again after 3 strikes? Do you want to put yourself through that kind of wholesale grief again?
Yeah. I don't know. Your dad grew up in and I don't even know, are there aluminum siding salesmen like your dad was anymore? Does that job even exist, or is that
sell aluminum?
Oh, what did he sell?
He worked for, you mean for most of his adult life?
Yeah.
Oh, he worked at a place called National Chem Search. He was a sales manager. It was a company based in Texas that manufactured industrial chemical cleaning things. And he trained salesmen.
So that's a job that still exists, but a lot of times that job is sitting at a desk, getting on a phone and calling or email outbounding.
Right. Dad was always driving around or flying. I'm leaving Monday. I'll be back Thursday evening.
Yeah.
And we'd see him for the weekend. He had a very strong work ethic. And since he was hired to train salesmen, well, he wasn't hired initially to do that, but ended up training salesmen. He would go all over, based in the West Coast, from wherever he was needed. The family initially, our family was from St. Louis, from a suburb called University City, Missouri. And that's where my sisters grew up, and that's where I spent from 0 to about 8. And then my dad was offered this job to work on the West Coast, to run the West Coast office, which was just opening up. So we all loaded up the truck and we moved to Beverly, sort
Yeah.
of. Well, we did take Route 66, by the way.
What is that like
from
for
the
a
song
kid,
of the same name?
to go across the Midwest and head towards this magical California place? I mean, that's got to be incredible for 8-year-old. You must remember all of it, because
I remember, and very fondly, I remember St. Louis, and I miss lightning bugs and playing in the snow, because the snow was nothing I had to shovel or drive through or skid, or it was just to play and build snowmen and all this, and lightning bugs were great. The trip across was fun, and of course I'm seeing all of these places I've never seen before, and my a lot of my ideas about what Los Angeles was like was based on I Love Lucy, where she'd always be running into famous people. So the drive across was the first of 2 trips we made. And then when we did the official, it's like once we stowed the car in LA, then we wrapped things up in St. Louis and flew out. And on the airplane out here, directly in front of us was Red Skelton, and several seats in front of him was Andy Griffith. And so it's like, wow, life really is like I Love Lucy. We haven't even gotten to California, and Red Skelton is sitting in front of us. And he was great, and he had one of those little wooden pop guns where you push the back and a cork on a string comes out, and he had that tucked into his suit jacket. So from time to time, he would turn around and shoot me with the pop gun. I'm sure, given the strict safety standards now, before you board a plane, there might have been a question about what's that in your pocket. That's it's just a gun.
I have a funny Red Skelton connection here. I think you might appreciate.
Sure.
So one of the guys that's been on this show, his name's Henry Longrare, and I believe he's still with us, World War II veteran. In The Longest Day, Red Skelton, his character comes in and he gets stuck up on the steeple.
Red buttons.
Shoot, red buttons. All right,
you're confusing your reds.
I got my reds wrong. Yeah, Red Barber. Anyhow, the story's kind of screwed up, but I'll finish it. Henry jumps in, and that's his friend up there. Like, he actually sees the guy hanging from the steeple, and he lands, on the house next door. And so you have these weird things where art tries to imitate life for real. In this
mean he really parachuted down?
He really parachuted next to where the Red Buttons character, Red Skelton character,
Red Buttons gets his foot shot.
Right, and he looks up. He's like, "Oh my gosh, my friend's dead," and then he moves on to the next thing. But these things really do happen, and then now you have life imitating art. And that on the airplane, you've got actors on the airplane, and so you're going to walk in, and there's going to be girls in bikinis. There's going to be all these.
Well, that wouldn't have mattered when I was 8. Also, it was much more traumatic for my older sisters because they had really solid friends for years that they went to school with. I had friends, but I don't remember it being particularly difficult to say goodbye to them. However, we also had a cat named Smokey. And the news was broken to me that the apartment we were moving into in Los Angeles didn't allow pets. So I was heartbroken that we had to leave Smokey the cat behind. But I don't remember being heartbroken that I had to leave every friend I had at the time
just
behind. Now, I still have the same priorities. My cat is the primary occupant of this apartment, and he lets me live here.
In your working on the book with Groucho, you're going through his personal effects while he's still alive, organizing, cataloging all these things. And then in your book with your dad, it's the same kind of process where you're going through these World War II letters.
Right.
I'm assuming you have both ends of the letters, letter home and then his response, or
no, they're just I say just in quotes because my dad, before he shipped out from St. Louis, and he ended up in Algeria in North Africa, and then from there to Sicily, to Italy, to France, to Germany, to England, and then back in November of 45 after both theaters of the war had wrapped up. But he and my mom vowed to write each other every day. And damn if they didn't get darn close. So Dad's letters are, there is almost one a day for
Wow.
2 years, from January 44 to November 45. None of them is one page. He tried to cram as much as he could on each side of each page, as many pages. So you get this really granular, detailed look at what it was like on a day-to-day basis for a staff sergeant who worked out of supply for the Signal Corps. And they weren't supposed to save the letters they received for two reasons. One is because they weren't censored. If the letters from home fell into the wrong hands, it could, if mom wrote, "I hear you're going to be liberating Berlin in 2 weeks."
Yeah.
You don't want the Krauts to get a hold of that. So, and the other thing is, Dad would have had to schlep a duffel bag jammed with hundreds and hundreds of letters from mom. But because he was so meticulous in his reportage, he addresses each of mom's statements, questions. He'll say, you ask about what what we eat, an average meal. You ask about what I need.
Right.
You wrote about an article you read about robot bombs on the East Coast. You're asking if to what degree we're in danger. And then the things that she would tell him about Carol, who's my oldest sister, was a toddler at the time, and that was really rough on Dad to have to say goodbye to his wife and infant daughter and to go thousands of miles away. And he's trying to be a parent to someone thousands of miles away, and mom is writing about, Carol got a cold, so Dad is freaking out, even though by the time he got it, she may well have been well.
Yeah. And you weren't alive yet, right? You're later on.
No, I was born in 54.
Right.
But Carol was born in 42. And so you're never supposed to divulge a lady's age, but she will be 80 years old this year, which is extraordinary to think of having an 80-year-old sister. And then I have a middle sister, Patty, who's in between our ages. So no, they just had Carol Francis, and almost all the letters are to my darling wife and baby, to my two sweethearts, to my adorable two, to all these permutations, but it was always to the two of them. And Dad he'd be talking about the things he would see and think, oh, Carol would love to see these animals, and Amy, you would love, I know how much you enjoy music, and he would talk about all these, it's just bursting with all these little anecdotes, going to a cafe in Algeria and watching a swing band try to play Pistol Packin' Mama. There's so many mentions of songs throughout the thing, because he'll say, oh, the radio is playing Begin the Beguine now. Can you hear it? I wish I were dancing with you at the Chase Hotel like we did. Everything triggers a memory. And it's so bittersweet for him to be reminded of these things, because the visceral aching for mom and baby Carol is just throughout the book. You really feel what he's going through. And it was something of a revelation for my sisters to read this, because the Dad we knew was quite stoic and unemotional. He rarely used the words love or hate.
Right.
If I said something like, oh, I hated that movie, he would say, I don't think you mean you hate it, Steve. I think you mean you didn't care for it. Well, the book is bursting with love and hate for the Nazis. He says, it's all I can do to not just grab my rifle and shoot one in the head when I see them come in from capture. Or when he was in Germany after the war was over in Europe, he would see the German soldiers welcomed by the villagers as heroes. And he would be thinking, what do they have to be celebrated for? And of course, the camps were liberated, and Dad was starting to connect with people who had been in the camps or had seen what had gone on there. And his hatred increased after peace was declared because he got an even more vivid sense.
Right.
And he was also trying to track down some of my mother's relatives because they were from Czechoslovakia and they were Jewish.
Yeah.
And there's one letter where he makes reference to, I think, a cousin of Mom's who was blind. And he said maybe the Nazis weren't as severe with blind people. And I thought, oh, man, all that meant was she was instantly exterminated.
Yeah. Can I jump in? I want to ask about, so I went to the Bosnian deployment for the military with NATO, and we sort of closed out the era of letter writing. We were still letter writing. We were still getting
newspapers and
magazines, and also catalogs. So we were still in the catalog era where you'd thumb through, and you would just thumb through the Macy's catalog or whatever it was, just to have something to do. Right?
And it's home.
Yeah, it was home. And you think about, oh, I want to go buy this when I get home, and all these other things. You definitely think about food because you get this. The food is not bad. It's just the same thing over and over again. So you have these things where we close that era out. We also opened the technology era, so a totally different time. But I understand what it's like to get a letter that someone has taken the time. One of my friends wrote me. You know, someone.
I mean, I knew even. I mean, this is hardly on the same scale. But when I would go away to summer camp, and I would get a letter from Mom, it meant the world, and I'd read it all carefully. And we'd only been separated for weeks, but it's like, wow, here's this handwritten note from Mom asking about this and telling me this. So these guys, these GIs, hung on every word. And when Dad wouldn't get a letter for a while, and he would say, now it has been 7 days, I may have to send you a V-mail, which were they were one-page letters that would be photographed and miniaturized so that large quantities could be sent back home. And he didn't like them because they were out in the open where anyone could read them, and B, because he was restricted to one side of one page, and some of his letters went 8 to 10 pages. And he would really start to get angry and aching and then there'll be a letter that say, well, I came back from Chow, and there was letters of yours from August 21st, 22nd, 26th, September 1st. So I'm going to enjoy them and savor them. And I think I'm only going to answer 2 at a time because I don't want to waste, And so, but there's so many pop culture references. You get his little thumbnail reviews of movies. Saw to Have and Have Not. I don't think this Lauren Bacall has any kind of a future. Her voice is too deep. And I think there'll just be 1 or 2 more pictures from her. And he'll talk about the impact on the GIs. He said, we saw None But the Lonely Heart with Cary Grant. And he said it didn't go over well with the boys. I don't think Clifford Odets is the right source for this. They really should give more thought to the kind of movies the boys want to see. And then if he liked something, and then he would compare notes with Mom and say, have you seen it yet? I haven't seen Meet Me in St. Louis yet, but I hear all these great things about it. And he said, I went to one theater, I could only stay for half the movie, Tales of Manhattan, which is one of those movies that's like several stories. And he said, I got up to the point where Charles Boyer is going to swing on the trapeze. If you saw it, could you let me know what happened after Charles Boyer swings on the trapeze? And then all the food stuffs. He would get, Mom would send him like cans of shrimp. And he would say, I'm going to hold out until I get cocktail sauce. And I'm thinking, here you are with the Luftwaffe strafing jeeps and your life being saved. You heard the whoosh of a bomb, and only because it was a dud did you avoid getting blown to smithereens. But it was like something out of the film MASH, where it's like an absurd detail that I don't want to open the shrimp till I get cocktail sauce. Because, I mean, after all, what's the point? And then, I should probably at some point mention that the title of the book is Salamis and Swastikas, letters home from a GI Jew. These salamis and the swastika is obvious. When I began to go through the letters, I was gobsmacked. And if you've ever had your gobsmacked, you know how painful that can be. At how many times Dad mentions craving a kosher salami.
Yeah.
That was it, like it represented home
Yeah.
and home cooking. And he would, it starts out innocuously with Louis got a salami from home, but he's Italian and they have that hard salami. And I'm wondering about a kosher salami. So, and then Mom sends him one and he tears it open and it had spoiled on its way during the summer in the hold of the ship from the States all the way over to Italy. And she's putting out the word to his brother and to other friends to send Dave kosher salamis, and they would arrive rotten and then finally started arriving edible. And it was just cloud nine for him. And he would ask for kosher pickles and talk about maybe I should open a kosher delicatessen out here.
Yeah.
And in fact, I didn't realize till after I'd finished the book, but famous Katz's Deli in New York has a slogan, send a salami to your boy in the army. Because during World War II, Mr. and Mrs. Katz had 3 sons who all fought against the Axis powers.
Yeah.
And they too craved kosher salami.
So
there's
thing.
all, and then, I mean, it's this subcurrent running through the whole book of letters. It occurs to me that it uses up a lot of your allotted meat points. And I don't want you to do that because you and the baby need to have nutrition. So let's hold off on the salamis, but thank you. And then a week or two later, if you happen to see one, maybe a small one,
yeah,
and those pretzel sticks were really good. And you don't have to send gum or lifesavers because we get plenty of those. And I'm not really crazy about tuna, but if you could send a salami, but if you can't, that's fine. And then he'd share it with the other boys, and he's talking about, they'll probably convert. It's interesting, the whole Judaism aspect, because Dad was essentially a secular Jew. He didn't go to Friday night services. He didn't observe the Sabbath. He liked the cultural aspects, the, Yiddish phrases and the delicatessen food. But his grandparents were strict Orthodox, but his parents weren't religious at all, which must have been rough on his parents, because it would have been like this big, like in the jazz thing, I have no son, no, you don't. So, but Dad, it's interesting to watch him get more in touch with the whole Jewish background as he deals with anti-Semitism overseas and gets to know Jewish people there and hangs out more with the Jewish guys in his unit. And it comes to mean more. He actually goes to a Passover Seder service in 1945 at a bombed out synagogue in Nancy, France. There's actually a picture of him eating matzah in the book. There's all these extraordinary photos in addition to the letters, dozens, like 48 pictures. And there's bombed out ruins, and there's dead Nazis, and there's humiliated French collaborator women, and these people that he got to know. He tended to get to know people in villages and tried to get them food and supplies and stuff. And you're also getting his reportage on history as it's happening. But even then, you're talking about getting books and magazines. He's reading analyses of World War II in Time magazine as it's happening.
Yeah.
And he even recommended a book that he was reading that was about the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich. And the war isn't over yet. And but he had a great sense of history. So he's also comparing it to World War I. And comparing what Roosevelt's going through to what Wilson's going through, and his prognostications about how the war is advancing, and the Russians are coming from this way, and I hope Russians get to Berlin first because they'll probably kill every goddamn Nazi after what they did to them in Stalingrad.
Right.
He has this, he loved history, even before the war, and had a sense of art and museums and historical events. And like, in November of one year, he said, well, today is Armistice Day, which celebrated the end of World War One, and said, but I don't know if that means anything anymore, because here we are in another world war. Will there be another Armistice Day for this?
Yeah.
And then extrapolating from that, I don't think we'll ever be done with wars. I think every 20 years or so, we're just going to have a war. Very philosophical, which again was a revelation for my sisters, because we didn't think he was as deep as the guy that wrote these letters.
It is a different level of life, though, when you're in a combat situation. In my case, going off the camp all the time, seeing the suffering that people do, seeing our mistakes as we try to help somebody else.
Yes.
You hit a different level of humanity that you're able to perceive and talk about. And so I'm curious, as your dad is moving around, and I don't know, did he ever go back to Europe or Africa ever again?
Yes.
Okay.
He did, but I actually was with him in France and in Italy, and he spent a little bit of time about, this was the road to Rome, and it was Casino and Anzio.
Yeah.
He was not one of those that was so traumatized by the war. And I talked to, when I was growing up, all my peers had fathers who were in World War II. Some of them would say he would never talk about it. Right. It was something we couldn't talk about, which is a shame, because that's a puzzle piece that will never be fitted into the jigsaw of history. The sense of history that I had working at Groucho's was also at work in editing these letters down to a readable size, because certain people have said to me, it's wonderful that you've this tribute to your father that you've done. It's wonderful that a son honors his father that way, and there's an element of that.
Yeah.
But I would never have taken on having to retype each of these into my iMac for months and months, bleary-eyed. All of these, much of them were handwritten.
Yeah.
So I had to decipher the handwriting, and then of course my mom would three-hole punch it and use those little white reinforcements on the holes, which would obliterate a word. So I'd have to figure it out by context. And he did have access to a typewriter because of requisition slips, but those were all single-spaced. So I would never have done this as just like a vanity project, like converting home movies to DVDs and putting people through boring things about just the family. And if you weren't there, you wouldn't know.
Right.
I was able to appreciate the fact that these, I said to someone, if I had bought a Foot Locker that was locked and I pried the lock open and inside were these letters from someone that I didn't know and had no relation to, I would still recognize their value, because as I say, a granular look at what it was to be a GI, going through, the weather and the foods and drinks and the celebrations and how to celebrate Christmas and Easter, and just philosophizing about, I see the Germans on Sunday going to church, and they look like people going to church anywhere, but what kind of God can they pray to if they allowed a monster like Hitler to take power? All these ruminations, and then Roosevelt's sudden death, which took everyone, he died, and around the same time Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, was killed in Japan, and Dad was a big fan of his writing, and Dad said something like, as we have gotten closer to victory in Europe, God has taken President Roosevelt and Ernie Pyle. I guess that is part of the price God is exacting in order for us to appreciate winning the war. So just very rich, tangible, I mean, blowing my own horn here, although it's really blowing Dad's horn. The blurbs on the back talk about, Steve Karras, who directed a documentary called "The Jewish Refugees," about face the Jewish refugee soldiers of World War II, said just one GI's pen to paper, and what a revelation. Sergeant David Stoliar's letters home are dense with humor, love, the right amount of army scuttlebutt, and soulful musings of a young American Jewish soldier in the war against Hitler. I'm grateful to Steve for making his dad's World War II history an important addition to the historical record. And, others have said that it's endearing and moving and unforgettable. And again, my sisters and I were kind of startled at the response to how emotional that people found the letters heartbreaking, but also amusing. And one of his letters, I mentioned that he gives little thumbnail reviews of movies.
Yeah.
One of them, he said, the movie tonight was nothing to write home about, so I won't. And I thought, how often do you get a chance to live a cliche?
Yeah.
It's nothing to write home about, so I won't. So, yes, sir.
One of the things I want to ask about is, when you're in the moment, you're focused on your job. Now, look, he's going to have more spare time than maybe some other people, depending on his job. I don't know how busy he was, but you only kind of know what you know, and there's so much rumor going on. Are we going to go to Japan? Are we going to do this? Are we going to go there? But also, when did it dawn on him the depth of the crime against humanity that the Nazis had committed?
You read it in the letters.
And then
there it is. And the people, he said, he went to have a pair of shoes made, and the guy who ran the shop that was making the shoes was friends with a Jew who had recently come back, I think from Dachau, and was talking about seeing a specific SS guy shooting dozens of Jews in a ditch. And they went to the local FBI place there. Dad went with him to report this. And the FBI guy's point of view was, well, we need more evidence. We really, it's this guy's word that this happened. And Dad was pissed because he said the Gestapo would never have given the guy the benefit. If they had any suspicion, they would bring the guy in and then see if there's enough evidence. But you don't let the SS guy wander around the same town that Dad was in.
Yeah.
Because we just don't have enough proof. But yeah, and then he talks about seeing the newsreel footage of the liberation of the camps.
Right.
And this is why we must exterminate every trace of Nazism. And one of the places they inhabited used to be a kindergarten, and he describes the anti-American things that were in there and the pro-Hitler and pro-Nazi. And he said, you see, it starts in the schools. They start indoctrinating the children. That is why it has to be. So he had just a remarkable perspective for a guy. He was a little older than the other guys. Mm-hmm. He was literally and figuratively the adult in the room. Mm-hmm. He was in his late 20s overseeing guys in their early 20s. And it really made a difference. He also, as I mentioned, had a really strong work ethic. And he would get disappointed when the ones underneath him wouldn't do a complete job, or they would give him crap because he was responsible for missing pieces of weaponry and clothing and things, supplies. And so they would see him as part of the brass, breathing down our neck. But then the real brass would breathe down Dad's neck and say, why wasn't a better job done of this? Stoliar, you need to do this. And Dad, you get to watch him say, I've had it with this. I don't care if they bust me down. If you get a letter from Private Stoliar next time, you'll understand why, except I need the extra $50 a month, so I'll put up with it. But he felt like he was getting squeezed from above and below. But there's so many stories in there. I mean,
did he have a realization of the Japanese crimes against humanity as well? And then also...
Not so much, although my Uncle Paul, who was married to my dad's sister Beulah, he was in the Pacific, and he saw horrific action at some of the,
Do you have a sense for why the Japanese history has kind of Is it because Hollywood's used Nazis as like the heel of all heels, or because they both were over the bar in terms of like atrocities,
Right.
but we don't have that same sense of.
Yeah, they were worse to the POWs than the Germans were, but I think the Germans were worse to the civilians, the concentration camps.
Yeah.
But the stories about, the Bataan Death March,
Yeah.
and we get Bridge on the River.
All of the murders in Guam and all these places, they would go and just butcher people.
Maybe they have better press people. I don't know. But you really, and Dad's fear of being sent to the Pacific.
Oh, yeah, talk about
Forgive
that.
my naivete. I always thought that the guys that were sent to the European theater fought that war, and then when VE Day happened, they came home, and then the ones that were in the Pacific continued to fight, as Dad would refer to them as the Japs and the Nips, because I did not sanitize what was then common parlance.
Yeah, he's a man of his time.
And then come home when that was over. But it didn't occur to me that once they had spent years fighting the Nazis, every other letter from Dad, well, I may be picking coconuts sooner than I thought I was. Well, now the latest scuttlebutt is that we're not going to be going over.
Yeah.
Well, now they're saying we might get a furlough, but I don't even know if I could handle a furlough because it would mean saying goodbye to you again. And I don't know if I could stand saying goodbye to you again. Now it looks like we're not going to have to go. Now it looks like we're going.
That's exactly how that goes.
Just back and forth and back and forth. And he's thinking, I think that I'll be home by Christmas, now that the war is over here, unless I have to go there. And then, of course, there's even his ruminations on the atomic bomb, that even though it brought about a swift end to the Pacific Theater, you still get his philosophizing about what have we unleashed? What does this mean for the future? And he had a lot to say about the politics of what's going to happen to post-war Europe with communism. He got mad at Mom for worrying that the Russians were going to be our enemies, saying, you're listening to the same people that were the America First people that didn't want to get involved in the war. The Russians aren't going to be like that. They're grateful to us and they hate the Nazis and and you'd get, talking about which countries he thought would probably go communist and why it was preferable to stay on this side of this country politically. And then his own worrying about what will it be like when I come back? You have him thinking out loud. Will I be able to fit back in? Will the war have changed me? Will I get a break before I have to go back to work for your father at the dry goods store, which is where he was working just before the war? It's just a rich story that I think I'm finding out, to my relief and pleasure, a lot of people are finding it riveting reading, even if they have no idea who Dave Stoliar is.
Well, I for one, for all of us out here, humanity, thanks for writing this. We're running out of trunks and attics with our grandfathers and fathers.
Well, I thought about how, that you get these Civil War diaries from just one Yank or Reb saying, well, the colonel says that we might be coming home soon. And it's like, on the Civil War documentary, you got all those, Dear Sarah, the winter's rough. And it was compelling, even if you'd never heard of the guy. And that was the historical perspective that led me to create Salamis and Swastikas, Letters Home from a G.I. Jew, which is, if you want to get a signed copy of that or Raised Eyebrows, you can go to www.stoliar.com and order either the Groucho book or the Letters book, or both if you must. Otherwise, they're easily available on Amazon, and I hope you enjoy them.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate you doing the show. Love doing these live remotes. It's been fantastic. Everybody definitely go. I'm super close now. Hey, definitely go to Amazon. Go get those books. I just finished the Groucho one. It's fantastic. And I can't wait to dig into the book about his dad as a guy, one combat veteran to another guy. I can't wait to read these stories. I hope someone saved my letter somewhere. It's probably a third of a book.
Not the same with email.
No, it's not. Yeah, a whole lot more different stuff. All right. Stand by 1 sec.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.